Hey, what's going on? My name's Joe, and today for my submission to the Zub Collection Club series, I thought I'd show you my custom-made Jundland Wastes diorama / playset, along with some of my collection of 3 3/4 inch Star Wars action figures. So let's get started. Cheers. So for starters, I'll show you this diorama that I made. Now this is meant to recreate the scene from A New Hope, where Luke Skywalker tracks down the runaway R2-D2, gets attacked by the Sand People, and rescued by ObiWan Kenobi. The Jundland Wastes are not to be traveled lightly. The majority of this diorama was made out of inexpensive insulation styrofoam that you can pick up at Lowe's or Home Depot, and it's been several years since I made this. I think I used a cigarette lighter to melt the styrofoam to get these rough, uneven edges, which is probably not the best idea. If you decide to do it that way, make sure you're in a well-ventilated area. I used toothpicks and Elmer's school glue to put the diorama together. Then I used paper clay to fill in these gaps in between the stairs here, these large stones in the back, and the little cave I made for R2-D2. These large stones and these wide, flat stones were both made out of the soft, green, floral styrofoam. These small round stones are just little balls of paper clay that I rolled up and pressed down onto the diorama. Years ago I bought a couple of Ultrarama display stands for my Star Wars action figures. The Ultraramas aren't being manufactured anymore. I think the company that made them actually went out of business, which is a real shame because I thought they were really, really great. They're basically just a plastic platform riddled with holes, and they included these small plastic pegs that fit into the bottom of the Star Wars figure's foot like that. And it basically just helps the figure stand a little bit more securely so they don't fall over and knock over other figures in your collection. So I decided I wanted to do the same thing with my custom dioramas. What I did was I gouged out a hole in the styrofoam here, I filled it back in with paper clay, and then I bought a couple extra baggies of these small pegs, and I used that to make a peg hole in the paper clay. Because if I just drilled a hole into the styrofoam, then it would have gotten all mushy underneath there, and it wouldn't have held the peg securely. When all the sculpting was finished, I brushed on a mixture of Elmer's school glue, craft sand, and dark brown acrylic paint. And once that was dry, I dry brushed the entire diorama with a few different shades of lighter brown acrylic paints. So my goal with this diorama was not only to recreate scenes from Star Wars, but also to make it look like a playset that Kenner might have produced in the late 70s. And I think I accomplished that pretty well. Alright, let's kick off the figure review portion of this video with R2-D2, since he's the whole reason why everyone's in the Jundland Wastes anyways. This R2-D2 figure was made in 2004 and is based on Attack of the Clones, because he has this opening compartment and retractable cable here that he uses to drag 3PO's head behind him. This R2-D2 figure also has a panel that opens up on his chest to reveal this tool that pops up, and I don't remember what that was for specifically. I only saw Attack the Clones once. I don't like the prequel trilogy. I don't really intend to collect anything from the prequel trilogy. The only things that I have bought were to fit in with my original trilogy collection of action figures, and aside from those little details, he's basically just a stock R2-D2 figure that looks very nice. I think the light brown dry brushing along this figure's lower body and his feet kind of make him specific to Tatooine or a desert environment. And here's a couple other figures that I have with sandy kind of paint jobs. This is a R2-D2 figure from 1998 with a little pop-up scanner. And then here's a R2-D2 figure that's electronic from 1996. And this is no joke. I have not replaced the batteries in this. These are over 20-year-old batteries. That's incredible. Up next we have the Star Wars Legacy Collection, Farm Boy Luke Skywalker from the Resurgence of the Jedi Battle Pack. He didn't originally come with those binoculars or the rifle. Those are from older Luke Skywalker figures that I have in my collection. I can't remember exactly which ones those came with. I just happen to have these figures handy. And for some comparisons, we have the vintage original trilogy collection Luke Skywalker with the soft goods tunic. We have the 30th anniversary collection Luke Skywalker figure that came with the moisture evaporator here. This is the vintage Death Star Escape Luke Skywalker figure. And this is an older Luke Skywalker figure that was meant to be an homage to the early bird pack. And he has the retractable lightsaber. I repainted him because the color seemed way off to me. This Luke Skywalker figure uses the same legs as the vintage original trilogy collection Luke Skywalker here. The torso and arms were reused for the vintage collection Death Star Escape Luke Skywalker right here. And even though Hasbro has never really nailed the likeness to Mark Hamill from this point in the series, I think that the Legacy Collection, Resurgence of the Jedi Battle Pack, Farm Boy Luke Skywalker is the definitive version of Luke Skywalker from A New Hope. And on a side note, the head sculpt for this vintage original trilogy collection Luke Skywalker looks exactly like my brother Eric. The way that I designed this diorama, I pretty much have to use a Luke Skywalker figure that has very good leg articulation so that I can get him crouched or kneeling behind that rock like he was in the movie. Here we have a Power of the Force 2 era C3PO figure from 1999. And this was part of a short-lived subline with flashback photos. It was kind of like bridging the gap between the original trilogy and Episode 1, and they had this little gimmicky thing in the card. Now there's lots of different C3PO figures that are better than this. The reason I use this one in particular for this display is because this one is specific to the Jundland Wastes scene from A New Hope. He has the sculpted sand detail in his shoulders and his chest, and also he has a removable left arm, because when Luke Skywalker and C3PO get attacked by the Sand People, C3PO loses his arm. So as far as the sculpting goes, from the neck down, this C3PO figure is pretty solid. I think the paint wash is a little bit too heavy-handed. The main drawback for this figure is the head sculpt, which I think is a little too elongated. So I happen to have a lot of C3PO figures handy. This is the Power of the Force 2 pull-apart C3PO from Empire Strikes Back, where he gets blasted to pieces by stormtroopers. There's a repainted Attack of the Clones C3PO. There's a repainted vintage C3PO figure. Don't worry, it was in really, really bad shape when I bought it. There's the vintage original trilogy collection C3PO. There's the flashback 3PO, and then there's a repaint of the flashback 3PO. Basically, I painted all the sculpted sand parts white, as if he got snow dropped onto him sometime during his stay at Echo Base. Here's the 5 points of articulation Force Awakens C3PO. And here's the vintage collection C3PO. That one's probably my favorite because he has the most articulation and has the most detailed sculpting. Alright, you want to get nuts? Let's get nuts. This is a Legacy Collection era C3PO figure from Return of the Jedi. And in Return of the Jedi, the majority of the cables and wires in 3PO's abdomen were going vertically. So my OCD prevents me from using him in this diorama, which is based on a scene from A New Hope. This is the ObiWan or ObiWan Kenobi figure that I like to use for this display. And I pull the hood up as far as I can, because in the movie when he shows up to rescue Luke Skywalker, at first you can't see his face because of the hood. This is the Star Wars Legacy Collection ObiWan or ObiWan Kenobi figure from 2008. This figure is my absolute favorite Star Wars figure of all time. He comes with a lot of great accessories like a soft goods robe, lightsaber. He also comes with a small table from his home that they use to project the Princess Leia hologram on, and comes with a little Princess Leia hologram figurine. He also comes with a Build-A-Droid part, which was a gimmick that they did at the time, similar to Marvel Legends Build-A-Figures. This figure's right hand is in a Jedi mind trick gesture, which I think is a really nice touch, and this figure also sports an excellent likeness to Sir Alec Guinness. These two figures came on the individual card backs like this, And then this figure came with the Resurgence of the Jedi multi-pack, along with that Luke Skywalker figure and R2-D2 and C3PO. That's why his robe is slightly different color. When I first got these figures all lined up together, I was worried that his robe had faded from exposure to sunlight, but that's not the case. I looked it up, and the robe from the Resurgence of the Jedi pack is actually a lighter color. This figure is super articulated. He has 14 points of articulation, including ball hinge ankles. Really, my only gripe with this figure is the robe is a little bulky and cumbersome, and you have to fuss with it quite a bit to get it posed the way you like. Alright, here's the Legacy Collection ObiWan Kenobi figure with a couple of other examples of ObiWan Kenobi figures that have the hoods up. So this is the Power of the Force 2 flashback photo ObiWan Kenobi, and that's a pretty decent figure. This is a ObiWan Kenobi figure that came in a 2-pack with Darth Vader. This is from the Power of the Force 2 days also. This is basically just a plastic statue, whereas this one has a few more points of articulation. He has swivel elbows and swivel wrists that give him a little bit more posability, and you can use his right hand as a Jedi mind trick hand. I like that pretty well. Alright, and to wrap up the figure portion of this review, I thought I'd show you my collection of Tusken Raiders, or Sand People. I always knew them as Sand People, and then in the late 90s is when I first heard the term Tusken Raider. I don't know if that was something from the novelization, because I've never read that, or if it was something from George Lucas's original script that just didn't wind up in the movie, or if it's a PC thing that happened in the 90s. Up until then, I always thought of these guys as Sand People. Now they're known as Tusken Raiders. So here we have the Power of the Force 2 Sand Person, Power of the Jedi Tusken Raider, Star Wars Saga Collection Tusken Raider. This came out around the time of Attack of the Clones on the blue card back. And then we have the Vintage Original Trilogy Collection Tusken Raider, and this is actually a repaint that was reissued in a Walmart exclusive line called Discover the Force that came out in support of the theatrical re-release of Episode 1 in 3D. Unfortunately, I was able to pick up 3 of these figures. So this Power of the Force 2 Sand Person or Tusken Raider is obviously the weakest one out of the bunch. His articulation, sculpting, and paint detail is on par with the other figures that came out at that time, but this figure in particular is probably one of the worst Power of the Force 2 figures because he's like perpetually looking down, and his hand on the right side is sculpted shut, so you can't use it to hold a weapon or accessory. This Power of the Jedi figure is a pretty big upgrade from the Power of the Force 2. He looks much better, but you can really only put him in one pose, and he looks best holding a rifle. This Attack of the Clones era Tusken Raider figure basically only has articulation in his arms, and he has a little play feature here where you can remove his head. I think that's meant to recreate a scene from Attack of the Clones where Anakin Skywalker decapitates a Tusken Raider, but he's probably the most dynamic looking one out of the bunch. This Vintage Original Trilogy Collection, or Discover the Force Tusken Raider action figure, is the best of the bunch by leaps and bounds. He's the best articulated, and he's the only one that can really achieve that classic pose where he's holding the staff over his head right before he attacks Luke Skywalker. And these soft goods robes, unlike a lot of other robes that come on 3 3/4 inch figures, are actually really easy to work with. Basically, you just pose the figure however you like, run him under a cold tap until the robes are saturated, and then pose the robe however you like. And as the robes dry, they'll stay in position. Another cool thing about this is that you can completely remove the robe and have a unique looking figure. If you wanted to army build these Tusken Raider figures, I would suggest buying up as many of these as you can, and then use a combination of these Power of the Force 2, Power of the Jedi, and Saga figures as filler in the back of your collection. The Power of the Force 2 and the Power of the Jedi figures in particular, you should be able to find pretty inexpensive on eBay, local comic book shops, conventions, or flea markets. Here we have my collection of land speeder vehicles scaled for the 3 3/4 inch action figures. This is the original vintage land speeder from the late 70s. This is the Power of the Force 2 era land speeder vehicle, and this is the vintage collection land speeder. This is the most recent 3 3/4 inch land speeder vehicle. This vintage land speeder was made in 1978. This is actually a hand-me-down from my brother from when he was a kid. And I still have the box for it. Obviously, it's in pretty rough shape. This land speeder vehicle has lots of really great play features. It's got a hood that opens up, and it just has a little plastic hinge right there, which I'm scared of breaking. I'll show you on the Power of the Force 2 version later. It also has a spring-loaded suspension system that you use this little lever here to raise or lower these wheels on the bottom. And the springs give it a really realistic little bounce whenever the vehicle moves. It looks just like it did in the movie. And the wheels roll very easily. This land speeder also has foot pegs for R2-D2 and C3PO behind the seats. Now, unfortunately, the windshield on this land speeder vehicle has yellowed over time, but other than that, I think it is in surprisingly good shape for having been played with by my brother and myself when we were both kids. Next up is the Power of the Force 2 land speeder vehicle from the mid-90s. And like a lot of the Power of the Force 2 vehicles, this is a slightly tweaked rehash of the original vintage mold. This vehicle has a new windshield that drops down lower than the original vintage version did, and this is more accurate to the screen, even though it doesn't really make any sense. Why would you have a windshield that drops down right where your chin would be at? Kind of defeats the purpose of having a windshield. But it is accurate to the movie. This vehicle also has some sculpted detail on the top of the body here that wasn't on the original vintage version. This Power of the Force 2 era land speeder has some updated seats, more screen accurate detail on the thruster here. And here's the opening hood feature that I didn't show you on the vintage version. It's just a little opening there where you can store weapons and accessories. It has a decal inside. And just like the original vintage version, it has the lever here that you can use to raise and lower the wheels. And here's what it looks like underneath when you raise and lower those wheels. It's a pretty cool feature that works really well. And just like the original vintage version, this Power of the Force 2 version has a lot of nice bounce to it, just like it did in the movie. The only drawback to this version is the color scheme for the body. I think it's way too light. And finally, here we have the Vintage Collection land speeder. This was made in 2011, and I kept the boxes for these vintage vehicles because I love the way they look so much. I typically don't keep boxes for my toys, but this Vintage Collection I made an exception for. This land speeder is without a doubt the most screen-accurate version that's ever been made. This Vintage Collection land speeder has lots of really great sculpted detail. It has the dent on the front here, and a dent sculpted in the body on the back here like that. It has this little fin on the hood that was not on the vintage or the Power of the Force 2 versions. This version actually comes with a steering wheel. It comes with a rifle that Luke Skywalker uses in the Jundland Wastes, and a clip to attach it to the side of the land speeder. And just like the other versions of the land speeder that I've showed you, it has the exact same feature for lowering and raising the wheels that the other versions did. However, this version has clear plastic wheels, which I think is a really nice touch. My only complaint with this land speeder is that it doesn't have the same amount of bounce in the springs that the other versions did. I think the springs are just too tight on this version, and it doesn't move the same way it did in the movie. But it's still a really nice model, it looks amazing, and it rolls very well. I like all these different land speeders for different reasons. The vintage land speeder obviously has a lot of sentimental value for me, because it's the one I played with as a child, and it still holds up surprisingly well. The Power of the Force 2 land speeder is the least expensive, and most easily replaced in case I were to break it. And out of the three, it has the most give in the spring-loaded suspension, which gives it the most convincing floating effect. The Vintage Collection version is the most screen accurate, with its attention to fine detail in the sculpting and paint departments. One drawback with the Vintage Collection version is that the smaller cockpit makes it a real chore to put figures inside, but that doesn't matter for the way I have it displayed in this diorama. So there you have it. There's my custom 3 3/4 inch Star Wars Jundland Wastes diorama / playset, complete with figures and land speeder vehicle. I hope you found this video entertaining and informative. I'd also like to thank Zubby for including me in the Zub Collection Club and for this opportunity to reach a larger audience. Please don't forget to like this video, leave a comment down below, share it with your friends, and subscribe to my channel for more videos like this in the future. Until next time, may the Force be with you. Take care. Bye.